Oh. There we go. Hello, thanks for joining me. I was going to start by asking, just to get familiar with the audience, how many people are developers, site builders, people who just care about getting numbers out of the site? A few of those. Yeah, so hopefully there's a little bit for everyone. I'm going to go over a little bit of an overview about kind of some of how Google Analytics works behind the scenes, some more developer-y stuff about how to actually do some of the customization of implementation, and then hopefully for the people who just want it to work, they'll see a little bit more of the possibilities so that they can prod everyone else to do some of those new features. I'm Jeff. I do a few projects on just contrib modules. Google Analytics is the one, I'll talk more about it a little bit later, that I'm using to do a lot of the functionality that I am. My favorite project right now is content security policy, which I'll mention again later. Something definitely for developers. Check out, good feature for kind of adding another layer of security to your website. You can find me on Drupal.org as Gapple. That's taken on Twitter, so there I'm GappleCat or GappleCA. So if you want to tweet at me, I have my notifications off and I'll check them later. I'm from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada, which you can kind of see in the background of the haze of that photo. So yeah, at its core, Google Analytics is pretty simple. There's basically 4 actions that you can do. When you install it, you do a create operation to say, hey, I want to connect to Google Analytics. I want to send it information and associate it with my account. You can require additional things that you want to add functionality. There's a bunch of core features, but then you can add plugins, whether they're ones that are provided already by Google, or there's some third-party ones that enable additional features. The next step is you set properties to say, hey, I want to describe things about my page, additional metadata that I want to include in my tracking, and then you send information. The core one that most people see is a page view. Someone has hit this page, and then that includes any sort of metadata. It collects a bunch of those things automatically. What browsers are people using? Where are they located geographically? A bunch of those sorts of things. That gives you a lot of functionality already, but that doesn't necessarily fit, your specific site. There's a lot of information that's unique to your content, whether you're publishing articles, whether you're creating educational resources, whether you're a media company and are publishing video or audio. There's a lot of metrics that are specific to those different types of content that aren't captured because it has no idea how to do it out of the box. So the basic operations start with create. It's the thing that you see when you get the initial snippet, is it's just add in your unique site code, and then it has another property of cookie domain. If you have a complex site set up with a lot of subdomains, you might need to customize it. But in a lot of cases, it's just auto. It'll set it to kind of whatever your top domain is and kind of figure it out from there. Usually you have to customize the cookie domains in Drupal itself. If you're not doing that, you probably don't have to care about it here. That one's usually straightforward. You usually see it already. The next step is requiring plugins. One of the handy ones is if you have multiple sites, a lot of connections, and you're tracking them all within one analytics property. There's the linker one that I have as an example that can actually connect the information between people across websites. So for example, I was working on a website that had separate domains for English and French. And using the linker plugin, we were able to track a user if they switch between languages, because there's different content available on each site. Maybe they are bilingual, that they want to view each thing, or maybe we just want to see how many people are hitting the wrong site first of all and need to go elsewhere. And then there's the set properties. So these are additional metadata that describe it. They're just numbered properties. You have to configure them on the Google Analytics side, though. If you have a free account, you have up to 20 of them. If you have a paid account, I believe it's 200. So depending, if you have the budget for Google Analytics and their paid properties, you can be fairly liberal with the amount of things that you track, as long as you're mindful, like you are sending more data. You don't want to spend anything that is kind of identifying of a particular user. That's against the terms of an agreement, and you probably don't want to be tracking that information anyways. So for example, for some things that I've used here is, maybe you want to track what kind of node type people are hitting. If the URLs on your site don't give you enough information to see what are people actually viewing between different types of content, different categories. So you can say this is an article, this is something that's associated with a particular taxonomy term. I worked on a website for a media company where they wanted to track what seasons and what episodes of particular shows are people looking at that isn't present in the URL. It's just video / title of whatever. So this allows to attach extra information on top of it. And it's any string that you want, and it's quite liberal in its length as well. A lot of times, I've been limited to a few dozen characters is all the information that I need to, but I believe you can go longer than that. The other set property is metrics. These are things that are countable that you want to do math on. So for example, a page view has a metric of 1. It's one page view, but you can add those up. You can order things by what's most popular, that sort of thing. The dimensions don't have that sort of value. If you're doing like a shopping cart or something, you want to track what people, how much people are spending. There's actually a plugin that adds sort of e-commerce specific features, but similar sort of thing with metrics behind the scenes that you can record, what's kind of the sum total of people's carts or averages of what people are spending. For myself, I've never actually used these properties on the projects that I've used, but they're available if there is something that you want to kind of add up and count. And then finally, there's the send properties. Up until this point, you create your tracker on the page. You set any additional metadata. It hasn't actually sent anything to Google Analytics yet. So the first one that you usually hit is the page view. And it has a bunch of automatic defaults in there where it pulls out the title of the page, the URL, and that sort of information. If you need to customize it, you can, but the very simple call to it is just saying, I want to send a page view, and figure out the rest. Sometimes you might want to alter the path that gets sent to Google Analytics to filter out information or modify it. One of those cases is if you have a special search implementation on your website. It can pull out certain search pages to see what terms people are searching for based on the URL that they're hitting, but you might need to modify that if it doesn't match that pattern. That instead of sending the default URL, you're saying, hey, I want to specifically send this altered URL in the format that, on the collection side, Google Analytics can figure out, this was actually a search, these were the keywords that were sent with it. And then some of the special ones where you get more functionality that can be unique to your site is sending events. So for example, I got a quick example here of sending a video. There's two required properties. They're just like a category and an action. So here we're saying we're playing a video, starting a video. Maybe you want to record, what sort of engagement people have. Are people watching more than a minute of the video, or are they watching the video till 50% of the way through? Events are typically things that are interactive on the user side. You would be triggering these through JavaScript, whereas the set properties, the page view properties, those are things that you'd probably be setting on the server side in PHP or in Drupal that go along with the initial page request. So yeah, I'll have another example later on. So like checking if someone reads, an article to say, hey, have they scrolled to the bottom to know that they're actually engaging with this content as opposed to just opening up this page. That can be helpful as well. Is on some sites, a lot of people will come to your site.
Are you talking about maybe like the read more? You read the first couple paragraphs of a news article, then you have to click read more to see the rest of it?
Yeah, potentially if you hide part of the content and say, here's your introductory paragraph, they click on a link and open more of it. Otherwise, the example I'll go is actually to say this is a full page article. if they just view the top of the page and go somewhere else, they haven't engaged with that article. If they scroll to the bottom of the page, we're probably sure that they've actually read the content. And one of the things that can be helpful for is your bounce rate. A lot of times people will come to a page, see an article, and disappear. They have no more visits on the website, and that looks like a negative metric. But if people are going to your site, looking at the content, getting value out of it from that single page, and then not coming back, you're still providing value to someone. You're still probably enticing them to come back in the future. So having those metrics to say, have they expanded an image gallery? Have they read to the bottom of an article? Those actually trigger Google Analytics to go, someone has done more than just hit this page and disappear, so this isn't just a bounce, and can actually affect that rate more positively, and give a better impression of how someone is interacting with your site and that it's providing value, rather than just people are disappearing because they don't think there is value. Another one of the handy things on the developer side is user timings. So out of the box, Google Analytics will track page load performance. Most of the modern browsers will actually break it down to say, how long did it take before you got your first byte from the server, and then how long did it take for the page to hit its initial rendering point. So you can actually use Google Analytics for performance metrics to say, like, hey, we've swapped around some of our JavaScript libraries on the website, we've added a new feature, our pages are actually taking a lot longer to render, and we want to optimize this performance. The limit is that's basically that first page load is all that can be done sort of automatically because it's integrated into the browser. Those numbers are available, and then analytics can send them away if they're available. Chrome and Firefox, I believe, both do this. I'm not quite sure about Safari and Internet Explorer. But there's a lot of other things that you want to track. So, for example, I built a website that rendered a pretty complex chart with a lot of information. And I was worried because, I loaded up in my browser on a fiber connection from the office. It loads fast, gets all the data really quickly. I'm on a fast computer using Chrome. It renders in half a second. Not too bad, but what happens if someone loads it up in an older Internet Explorer browser, or if they're on their phone? I don't quite know what that performance is going to look like. I can test it myself, but I don't know what real users in the real world are going to see. So that, in that case, gave me the metric to say, like, how much data can I actually load? Do I need to put in the effort of being more dynamic in loading a fragment of the data and, loading more as the user interacts with it, or making them need to refresh the data to look at different pieces of information to say, if this chart is taking more than a second, or like in one case, 5 seconds to load, it's going to be really frustrating. And tracking that information of timing, when did they hit the page, how long did it take until they could actually see the dynamic content that they actually care about, allowed me to prioritize my effort to say, how do I want to increase performance or change the functionality to make sure that people just don't get frustrated and disappear. So that it's pretty simple, giving a category and variable of what you're tracking that you care about. So you can say, I'm getting a REST resource of a particular type, or, change that to a post to say I'm submitting information. How long does it take it to get back to the server? Or some of those just purely front-end ones. You might be able to track on the server side how good your API's performance is, what's your average page rendering time, but that doesn't track when it gets to the user, how it's processed on the front end, any sort of thing like that. So it gives additional insight into that. It tracks, the units here are milliseconds, so you can be fairly precise. And then one of the last ones, it's very similar to events, but it's kind of just a handy layer to categorize it a little bit differently, is social interactions. Usually these are specific to a particular network, whether it's a share or a like, or here I labeled it tweet. And this gives you another category if you have, either you're doing just custom links with intents on your website, or you have a more interactive widget. A lot of them actually will fire JavaScript events when someone clicks on, the Twitter logo on an article. It'll fire an event, and you can react to that to say, okay, this is opening up a new page for them to actually do the action, I also want to record that in Google Analytics to say someone actually, did this on my website, rather than having to go to each different service to say, how many people shared this article or what sort of analytics, is Facebook telling me about my own links on Facebook, is that you can actually pull these things into your site itself. So I had an example, like if you're just doing it, pasting something in line, you don't need any dynamic functionality. This is kind of the basic structure of how they work. First, you create it with your property ID. You'll set any dimensions, metrics, any metadata values. Then you'll send your page view. And then other items are more dynamic to say that this is a user interaction, we're responding to a JavaScript event, and then we're sending the corresponding thing. This is the snippet that I recommend. If you look on how to add the Google Analytics, analytics.js to your website, it still recommends an older version that doesn't use the async attribute. That only affects like Internet Explorer 9 and below, I believe. And it's not going to be a huge impact if you're putting this at the bottom of your page too. This one allows you to move all of this code out of an inline script and put it into an external file. That allows it to be cached, reduces your page load time on the initial ones, but is also allows you to prevent inline execution. You're not reliant on any inline code. Drupal 8 scrapped all of, pulled out its need to use any inline code, so it does actually enable a bit more of a security feature. So that leads to the module that I built and used to enable all this stuff. There's a couple reasons that I started building it. I recently moved it, just for reference. It used to be under the namespace of GACSP. The CSP stands for Content Security Policy. I moved it to just GA, so it's drupal.org/project/GA. There's a couple reasons that I did this. Object-oriented programming, scary for some people. I find nested arbitrary arrays of information a lot scarier for me. So I wanted to build a module that was a little bit more cohesive in how it worked. It actually gives you, some restrictions on how you put information, how you have to kind of program your code to interact with it, but gives you a lot more safety and assurance of you're doing it the right way. It's really hard to mess up an object creation statement, as opposed to if you don't structure your array properly, it's really hard to throw good errors for someone to understand to be able to fix their problem. And the other one that I mentioned is content security policy. So Drupal 8 out of the box has no inline scripts. One of the most commonly reported security vulnerabilities in Drupal is cross-site scripting. And as long as anyone can type into a box on your website, Drupal 8 is a lot better with Twig auto-escaping, but there's still a risk that you might miss it, some module that you install might miss it, that someone is able to type in a box somewhere and that's output on your site unescaped and arbitrary JavaScript gets run. If you know on your website that there's no inline JavaScript, you can tell the browser now with content security policy to never run any inline scripts on the page. So even if someone is able to add it onto the site, the browser just blocks it outright. So that was one of the other ones that I wanted to enable this module, is that it as well doesn't use any inline JavaScript. You can code against it in a way to keep that state across your website and enable you to have that extra security layer, at least on a simple level. So I was originally going to do some live coding and then decided that was probably a bad idea. So I have everything coded beforehand, and I was going to walk through it. For this, if anything is a little unexplained or if you'd like some more details, feel free to interrupt me. I hope to do it in a cohesive manner, but I don't mind going back and explaining more if I miss over something. What I'm using as a base for this is actually the new out-of-the-box initiative Umami module. I think it's a great setup for me to do this demo, as well as if you're testing any of your own little features and stuff and just need to spin up a quick site. I found it really helpful of just basic content types. I can make sure that all my features work without having to customize, custom build a site that I have to maintain in order to do that. So to establish this, first, you can do it however you like. I started with the Drupal project composer structure. Basically just spun up a site, did a site install. There's a couple things that I later did an update, and a couple things are broken because I haven't reinstalled the site. But I don't think that'll affect things as they are today. So yeah, basic structure. Still readable there, but dark. Is for contrib modules, just to navigate around a little bit better, I have the admin toolbar, and then I've installed the GA module, and then I've got this custom module. So I go into the configuration side first, and I want to configure Google Analytics. The only thing that you actually need, by default, it's turned on, but if you really need to customize the functionality of your website, you can turn off any of the default stuff that it does and basically use it as an API to say, I want to do all my own custom commands, reporting structure. You can turn everything off and handle it yourself, or you can just say, I only want it to do the limited amount of stuff that I do. So you can, in fact, if you want to change the create statement that gets added to the page, you can just remove this tracking ID and then add it to the page yourself after. And it works just fine. It won't throw any errors if you don't have it. It's not actually required. Or, if you want to customize the page view event, it's a toggle to turn it off. So out of the box, installing the module, the only thing that I need to configure here is just adding that property ID, which I've set up previously in the Analytics admin. And then I want to customize it. So that's sending my page viewer requests. It's not sending any additional information. If I go to the Umami theme, like a couple of the examples that I have for when I want to pull in is, I want to track, I got these recipes. I want to see, what difficulty do people care about? That's something, sort of additional information that's on each recipe. How hard is it estimated to be? Low, medium, hard. To be able to track, are people really liking the low difficulty articles so that, that's the most viewed thing, so that I should do more of them? Or maybe I don't have enough hard difficulty ones, so people just aren't seeing that content on the site because it doesn't exist yet. So maybe I should try creating more of this thing that isn't represented in my analytics to see if that helps improve engagement of people accessing that sort of thing. And then as well as a taxonomy term. So the difficulty is a field on each one. The recipe category is a taxonomy term. So some related information. And you can get more complex in this. Here it's just a taxonomy term applied directly to the node. Other instances where I've had kind of complex hierarchies of nodes, I think one site I had 3 levels deep of node references that were using kind of the categories and nested information. And I needed to be able to pull information from any of the higher nodes in the category or in the hierarchy to be able to track information kind of in those custom dimensions to apply to the site. So there, as I mentioned, there is some setup beforehand. So in the Analytics admin console, custom definitions, there's both dimensions and metrics. And I've set up a few beforehand. Could have scroll up. So the 3 I pulled out, recipe category and recipe difficulty, are relevant to recipes. Author is relevant to articles on the website. These are kind of hit level dimensions. So this would apply to, I'm sending a page view or I'm sending an event. And here's some metadata that describes those things. There's a couple different types of things that you can track to say session level information. So for example, like where someone came from. They came from a promotion on another website, and I can track that sort of thing. I want to apply this to any of the pages that the user visits later, as they're browsing that site in the next half hour, to say, okay, if they have subscribed to our newsletter, I know it's because, 3 pages ago they came from, a promotional email or whatever. One of the other ones is that user-specific properties, if you have some some kind of demographic information or that sort that you have against a user, you can apply those that are logged with each of any of the page views events that you send as well, but reference the visitor visiting the website as opposed to metadata about what they're visiting. They're each given an index of a number, so they're semi-permanent. As I said, you get 20 on a free analytics account, a lot more. So you can retire these eventually if you need to. If you're on a free account, you can reuse them. Just be aware that your old data and your new data are going to be tracking very different things. So you might need to cycle through them a little bit. To get started, this is where the code comes in. The module on the administrative side can't make any assumptions about the structure of your content, what information you're pulling out, that sort of thing. So you do need to create a custom module to kind of add in that information onto the corresponding items on the page. So the first step is just creating the module. We've got the module folder, an info file, and that's the kind of the main core thing. And then we need to declare a service. So going along with working with Drupal 8, I've opted here to use an event as opposed to a hook. It has a little bit more boilerplate and overhead to set up, but there's a few advantages in being able to work with some of the object-oriented structure. So the most important point here is I'm just defining a class that's going to be responding to this thing and tagging it as event subscriber. So behind the scenes, Drupal 8, when you spin up on the site, it goes through and says, are there any services on the site that have this event subscriber tag? Get all of the events that each of them want to listen to, and then later on, when any of these events are fired, now I know all of the ones that I need to interact with. So it's just a little bit of a different structure as opposed to hooks, which hook implementations are cached, but you don't do any pre-definition other than saying, I have this function with a special name. Here you have to have this extra kind of layer to define beforehand everything that's going to respond. If you don't define the service, if you don't tag it as an event subscriber, Drupal doesn't know that it should be asking it what it wants to respond to or calling it when it's time. And then I'm passing it another service, in this case the current route match. This gives me, at the first level, just access to what page are they hitting, what's the URL, but also any objects that are associated with it. So getting into the code, it is how I access, if someone's viewing a node page, give me the node of that page that they're viewing. So pulling up the class, it's namespaced according to module Drupal Umami, grouped into a subset namespace of event subscriber just to keep it organized. In this case, this is our only event subscriber. And we're implementing the event subscriber interface. The important part from the interface is this get subscribed events. So we're saying, and from that we're responding that the event we want to respond to is the analytics events collect. So that's once the page is kind of done loading and all the information is available, the analytics module says, hey, is there any modules that want to add any additional information that I want to include on this? It itself responds to that to say, yeah, I want to add that create statement with my tracker key, or I want to add the page view event or not, as such is the case, or I want to enable particular plugins. In here, we're saying we want to do some custom behavior too, and we're specifying the method, and then you can see below that it's actually just a method on the same class. And then for the constructor is that from that service definition, we're saying we want to pass in the current route match service. That works with the route match interface. We want to store it on the class so that we want to be able to use it later in any of our functionality. So the basic ones, as I said, we have those properties on the node. We want to track what's the kind of difficulty of the recipe, and which was a field, as well as the kind of category, the type of cuisine it was, that sort of thing. So we have the on analytics collect. I like to break things out quite a bit. Otherwise, this could be a pretty messy method. So the two things that I'm doing here is I'm saying I have my route match, and I want to get an object out of it. If I can get a node out of it, do a particular thing, I want to add attributes based on this being a node page. If there's a taxonomy term, is kind of the main object of the page, I want to pull that out, and then I want to apply the attributes. So I pass along the event. If you're familiar with working with JavaScript, it's pretty similar. The event wraps some information of what kind of event it is, some additional information to say what properties. In JavaScript, it's what element on the page is corresponding to this event. So similar to here, this event has properties to say, we have a set of analytics items that we want to add on. And it gives us methods to interact with those. So this just kind of breaks it out into say, I'm operating with different types of entities. Similarly, if you wanted to track information on a view, you would have a view parameter would be available on corresponding routes. So this can get as complicated as you need to, depending on each of the types of entities that you have on the page. Some of the ones that I haven't dealt with myself is like media entities in the future have their own URL, have their own path. And if you have access for people to view, media entities on their own, you could similarly do analytics tracking on those pages as well. That would be different than, the nodes and items that they have. So here I'm grabbing node information, and so accessing through the entity API. So the recipe category is a taxonomy term. It's a multi-value field, so I'm saying, hey, if this node has a field called recipe category, pull out the first item, grab the entity from it, breaking it in here to grab the name, and its category, it's whatever string, and then similar to how Google Analytics expects it on the JavaScript side, if we have it's sending a function, the first parameter is the action that you want to do, which is a set, and then you're giving it any other keys that are properties. Instead here we're creating a new object of set, and then we're passing in properties. So in this case that's dimension number 1. Here's where one of the first advantages over, Drupal 7's arbitrary unstructured arrays is that this can actually validate, did you give me a key that makes sense? Did you give me a number that's valid? Or it can actually give you an error. So when you're coding against this, it'll pop something up sooner, hopefully, to say, hey, I don't understand what you're telling me to do. You need to fix this before you send it to production. And then we're just passing it in the string. Similarly, field for the difficulty, that is a text field directly on the node, so it's a little bit easier to pull out just the value from it. And then in that case, I've done it before where I'm pulling out a category where it's just like, does it have this field and I want to apply it onto the page? Or, is this specific, and that'll pull it out for any node in the future that has a difficulty field on it. It'll automatically include it. You don't have to target it to each specific node that you're doing. Otherwise, if you do care, so for example, I don't want to, recipes on this site don't have an author. So I don't want to track that information because it might not be relevant. It, might not, it might be a system user that has a bunch of these recipes, and I don't want to track that in my analytics. So I only care about the articles that are actually associated with a real author on the page. So just matching on the bundle, and similarly, the node object thankfully gives us the ability to pull out the related user and get the name from it, and in these related entities, so you don't necessarily have to pull in a lot of other services from Drupal. In other cases, I've had to pull in kind of the language manager service, or pulling out more entity information sometimes does require the service to be able to query arbitrary entities to pull out information. Yeah, so it's very similar for taxonomy terms, and this is kind of where we get sort of the different way of accessing. So if I'm pulling out the category on an article that's related information, I want it in dimension 1. If I'm viewing kind of a listing page for a particular type of recipe, that is viewing the taxonomy term itself, and I want to pull out the information directly from it. One of my sites in particular, you know, if you have a nested taxonomy, that was one where it was more complex, where I wanted to get that whole tree to say, you know, are people looking at the top level of the taxonomy or 3 levels down, and to be able to group things together, you know, in the analytics after the fact based on those. So this was a way, you know, in here I could pull out, okay, you know, what are they viewing, pull out whatever taxonomy term that they're doing, process it, format it a way that needs to go into the analytics, and then put it into the key, whether it's top level on the taxonomy term itself or on a node. So if I view the site and I want to check that this is working, I can pull up the dev tools. And if I reload the page, so the things that it pulls up that are relevant, other things to check. When you're doing anything with analytics, or if you display ads, make sure you disable ad blockers. I frequently forget that. So what it works is it loads the analytics.js from Google. This is kind of delayed on the website. This is kind of tagged as the lowest priority thing to make sure that, you know, your images, your JavaScript for someone to be able to interact with the website all load first. Commands can still be queued up so the website knows, hey, I have all these other things that I do need to eventually send to the server, but I don't want to slow everything down until that happens. So then finally, at the end, the last thing that we get, and we can filter it down, is sent to collect. So you can look at the parameters on this. They're filtered down to be a little bit shorter in what they send, but we can see that we're sending the page view event. We can see the property it's getting sent to. It's pulling out some information based on kind of the page, and we can see these custom. So CD1, CD2 are our custom dimensions that are associated with this property. And on the front end, we can see these valuables that it's sending. This is a main course, and it's a medium difficulty item. On the Drupal side behind the scenes is that all of these items are passed through a Drupal settings object. So behind the scenes, they are actually converted to an array that gets put on the page. So we can see that each of these items, similarly to, you know, as I said, there's that function called GA operation, whatever properties we want to send it. Similar to a lot of times within Drupal, you'll see the call user function array method call to apply, you know, some properties in an array as parameters to a function. JavaScript has that same functionality behind the scenes. So on the Drupal side, we queue all these up, we wrap them up in JSON to make sure that they keep their formats, and send them in Drupal settings, and then the module itself iterates through all these when the page loads to be able to send these to Google Analytics and make use of them. The order of these, you know, as I said before, is important. If you do a set call after you do the send call, the send call is already gone. It doesn't have that information on it. Sometimes you might want to do that, you know, if you're sending an event that has additional information. But in the large case, you need to make sure that these things are ordered. And the module actually takes care of that behind the scenes. So every time that you create a new set class or an instance of the set class, it's given a priority. You can change that if you need to, but by default, it orders that into the correct order to make sure that any of the set calls that you add in Drupal, no matter how many event listeners that you have, you know, if you break it down into different modules or how many commands that you're adding, it makes sure that it's added in the correct order so that it's safely tracking your information. So that hopefully reduces a little bit of the overhead in making sure that your analytics are sent correctly, and tracking everything that you need them to. So that takes care of things on the Drupal side. As I mentioned, otherwise, I'll pull up an article here. That one had the author as a property. And I can pull that again in this case, and we can see that it's setting dimension number 3 this time, and just by the author name, and then sending the page view. So it's only sending the relevant dimensions that are added based on kind of that event listener. The next one is the kind of interactive component. Someone is doing something dynamic on the page, whether it's playing a video or, are they reading into the end of the article? Are they engaging with some sort of media on the website? So that's where in Drupal 8, everything is, all the JavaScript is defined in a library. We have 2 dependencies here. We're just adding our own single JavaScript file. And we have 2 dependencies. Since we're responding to events, we want to use jQuery's handy event listener wrappers, and then we want to require the library from the main analytics module as well. This just ensures that the JavaScript is added to the page in the correct order, so that if we do make a call to that GA function, we don't get an undefined notice. You can code a little bit defensively to make sure that if it isn't there, it doesn't break, but hopefully we want to track everything correctly. But that makes sure that everything's ordered. It's not added to the page yet, so in order to do that, here's the first place where I get into doing some procedural code, where I want to pre-process the nodes. And I want to say, if we're viewing an article in its full view mode on its page itself, we want to add this particular library to do some additional tracking. You can add things globally if you need to, if it's a more generic one. For example, if you're tracking file downloads, you'll probably want that on every page of your website. So that can be added in your hook page attachments. Here I'm doing it in preprocessed node. There's other places where you can attach libraries, wherever it's kind of most relevant to the type of content that you're loading. And then the JavaScript itself. So the idea is that, as I mentioned before, I want to see if someone is actually kind of making it to the end of the article, that they're engaging more than just jumping off the site if it's not relevant. So I'm doing a metric just here to say, I want to check the scroll. It's a little bit more complicated because scroll events fire very frequently on the desktop, and I don't want to slow down someone's experience just to do their analytics. So I'm just going to meter it. I'm going to have a function that I'm only going to fire every 100 milliseconds at most. Every time it fires, I'm going to check what's the main article on the page. Again, I'm doing that same, using the classy classes, finding an article, making sure it's the full article view. If you have multiple article views on the page, this might break down, but however you find whatever content you're trying to track. And I'm trying to find where I want someone to scroll, kind of what should be in view on the page. So I'm finding where the article starts, how high it is, and saying if they get to 90% of the bottom of the page, that's good enough for me to make sure if they don't quite hit the bottom because there's some margin or padding, whatever, I don't want to exclude that hit. And then figuring out is when they're scrolling, just saying where's the bottom of the page hit, as opposed to measuring by the top of the page. So is it in view rather than, have they scrolled past the thing that I care about? And then if those match up, I want to send an event. I'm giving it article read, tracking some very basic information. You can add another property to say, like, is there a numeric value associated with this article? The documentation usually goes like the lower numbers are better kind of sense. We're tracking this as in performance, but this could be any sort of thing. So potentially you could track how long is it taking people to read an article, and probably pull that out later on the analytics side. And then finally, I'm just saying, if they've read it once, I don't want them scrolling up and down the page to fire off the event multiple times. So just once they hit the end of the page, stop listening. If they reload the page, it'll do another check. So yeah, so targeting, and then just attaching it to that scroll event. And making sure that it only hits, as I said, every 100 milliseconds there. So I've already got this page loaded up. Shouldn't have fired yet. So I'm going to go to the network. I'm going to filter on collect, and if I scroll down, there I've triggered it. So these are sent out. Google Analytics does it by, typically it still attaches an image to the page with additional parameters. So you can look at the parameters of what it's sending and see again, since I set that dimension previously of the author of this article, this is sent alongside that event as well. So as in addition to seeing, similarly on the page view, what author of my site is getting the most page views, I can see what author on my site is getting the most article reads. And then the attributes were kind of those event properties that I sent as the category in action article read. So similarly, you could trigger this on, anything like video plays, audio plays, anything like that.
Like filters and big tables that you've got.
Yeah. So on the admin side, as you can see, I've been poking around, and it's saying that I've hit traffic. So I can see I'm hitting active pages. The real-time view is a little bit limited in kind of the custom dimensions that it'll allow you to access. It's really just focused on what are the primary items that you can see who's active and hitting on your site right now. It's a little bit more interesting on a more active website. You can both see just page views, events, so you can see what people are reading. And then a little bit more interesting information comes in the behavior. Some of the properties that it was pulling up before weren't coming in here, so we'll see what it hits. But you can pull up information on the pages. And I'll just select a wide range. In these aggregator reports, it takes a while for the information to get there. Some of the configuration might not have been when I was messing around with it before. But you can see what particular things you're hitting. So here it's just pulling up pages, and in this case, since everything is categorized in the path by articles or whether it's a recipe, you can do filters based on what is the URL of the page. But you can also filter by secondary dimensions here. So if I filter by recipe, I can say, okay, well, what's my recipe difficulty? It's going to add another property. So it's saying, what are my most popular ones, but it's also breaking it down by recipe difficulty, as well as additional items. It's filtering out anything that isn't a recipe, doesn't have that difficulty, so I can see kind of which ones are getting the most views. And you can do custom reports as well. So if you care, if you don't really care about the page value, you can say what are, the most popular category and difficulty combinations and report only on those to say, what are the aggregate numbers of those particular items. And similarly for events, I can see what are my top events, and here I only have that one kind of article read, see what page those events are happening on. So that gives us a little bit of information already to say, what are our most popular articles, to say which one is getting the most people reading through the end. But if I go top events, I can pull up the secondary dimension, and then I had that author property so that I can divide that out to just say, it's not just people that are reading articles, but they're reading, and Holly is getting more reads than Megan at this time. So there's a couple other things that I mentioned before. User timings can be really valuable. I don't have sort of an active code example for that one, but for sure, measuring things, especially user interactions, this can be really valuable, especially if you're starting to adopt things like React and decoupled. You might be able to monitor the server side, processing times, but if you have really good caching on your server, that's going to be really fast. You still want to know how it's affecting your user, and you can monitor those sorts of things. So the basic structure is you just say I'm grabbing a time, before I do my action, I'm getting a resource, and then when it's done, I'm pulling in and saying, what was the difference in the time, and then I'm sending that along. So there's the general site speed report. I don't think it's pulling in information right now. It's pulling hits, but it doesn't have any kind of averages. One of the things for the site speed is that if you have sort of a low volume, low traffic site, it is metered to only a certain percentage of hits. So you might not get very valuable information. You can bump that up in the settings to say, I'm not getting very many hits, I want to track everyone, or once I'm starting to get a lot of hits to filter that back down. And then you get the user timing values as well, where you can break things down by category to say, how long are each individual thing happening on the website. So it's really valuable to be able to pull back to a developer to say where should we be optimizing things or what's our experience. If you're doing stuff on the JavaScript side for events, you can just send these keys sequentially, just strings in the function. It's a little bit simpler if you're typing that in, but if you're doing any dynamic actions, every analytics command accepts a fields object as the last value, where everything is keyed. It's a little bit easier to send these actions dynamically if you need to swap around these keys as things execute. So that's another format that's helpful to send. You can mix and match, but I recommend kind of either going all the simple way or all the object way. And then one of the other complex uses is, as I said, for tracking file downloads or those sorts of items. So this gets a little bit more complicated in saying, I want to click when someone goes off my site, what URLs are they hitting? What am I referencing that they care about? One of the things to keep in mind, so I'm just doing some filtering to say, does it have an HTTPS to make sure it's an absolute URL? Is it one that isn't the same site that we're already on? And then there's this transport property, because when someone clicks on a file link on your own website or an outbound link somewhere else, as soon as they hit that navigation, the browser will stop executing any JavaScript on your site itself. So it won't be able to track that click. So Beacon is actually, it's available in Firefox and Chrome, Internet Explorer 11, I believe, and not yet in Safari, but should be in the future, where it kind of sends that interaction behind the scenes in an asynchronous way rather than including an image in the page. It will continue to send that request even if you navigate off the page. But again, it's not going to get that same kind of resolution for older browsers that don't support it. Depending on your usage, that might not be great. So the way to get around that is there's the hit callback property, where the idea is when someone clicks on a link, you prevent the link from doing its default action, so it doesn't actually navigate away. You send off the analytics event, and then once the image is added to the page, it's got the response to say we know this event has been tracked, then we actually redirect the user. Obviously, the limitation to that is, the analytics event could take 50, 100, 150 milliseconds to return, depending on network. Hopefully, Google Analytics is very performant in getting that response, but it is going to delay those user interactions. So it has a little bit of a not so fun effect on the user side, but it is going to ensure that every single thing is tracked, whereas the beacon is not going to affect performance, but you might be missing out on information if you have a lot of visitors on older browsers, and not even that recently old browsers. So yeah, that's most of the details. As I said, I was going to pull up the project /project/GA used to be under GACSP, where most of the users are today. There's a few issues. Someone asked about integration with WebForm, which I don't use enough to interact with. As I mentioned, there's a Google plugin on the analytics side for enhanced e-commerce, which is really valuable for tracking in analytics what products people are looking at, what their total cart purchase is, that sort of thing, and being able to associate it with other things. That's one thing that hasn't been integrated yet, just because it takes a while, not that it's hard. But yeah, if those are a couple of things that you're interested in, those are a couple ideas for new features on the module to be able to add functionality that might provide value to you in the future. So, thank you. Any questions?
So some of the interaction tracking that you were showing, you can also just do that directly with Google Tag Manager, correct?
So yeah, there is another plugin I haven't worked with myself. Where's the link? There is another plugin for analytics itself that it automatically does a bunch of, are people clicking on the page and that sort of stuff. I think they mentioned like Google Plus has kind of direct interaction with Google Analytics. It'll send events anyways. Tag Manager does have a few of those built-in features. For some of this, for sure, like the limitation of Tag Manager is it's all client-side. So, the server still has to send some of that metadata information to be made use of anyways. So this pulls it back to, in your page build, you can send that information along to make use of it. And, there might be other ways to bridge that with Tag Manager, but hopefully this is, as seamless as possible. What is it? The other one, there is, this uses analytics.js to include things. The main Google_analytics module on Drupal.org has a new version that's supposed to be using GTag behind the scenes to do stuff. I don't know what state that is in. That's something I haven't had experience with, but that might be something in the future, whether this module can handle that or another module does the same sort of thing.
I'm new to the whole Drupal ecosystem, so I'm just not sure if Tag Manager doesn't work well with Drupal sites, or it sounds like you are doing this the other way just because you want to be able to take variables that aren't available in JavaScript on the client side.
Yeah, the big difference I've seen between Tag Manager and kind of direct integration with it, Google Analytics, Tag Manager, a lot of times it's a marketer that wants to put something on the website. They have some JavaScript that they want to include, and they don't want to go to a developer to add it. So that's really handy, but yeah, for some of this analytic stuff where you're adding this additional metadata information, the marketer can't expose that information, isn't going to know how to add a JavaScript snippet to include that. So this does require a little bit more of a developer interaction, but gives a little bit more of a richness to what you can track. Whereas Tag Manager allows you to iterate very quickly on, someone who isn't as technically knowledgeable, or maybe you only want to add a script very briefly on the site. You don't want to go through the whole deploy process for something that might exist on this website for a couple pages just to check something. Tag Manager just has a little bit of a different use, and they can work side by side very well. I've seen that in many other cases where we had to do very custom analytics tracking, but they had other properties that they just wanted to manage through Tag Manager. And as long as you're not trying to do Google Analytics through both, in that case they would interfere, but if they have separate responsibilities, then they work alongside each other without an issue.
Okay, cool,
Thank you.
I would second that, because that's what we end up doing. We use Google Tag Manager, and we end up using the data layer module to get the information from the server side into Tag Manager for us. We use it exactly because we are a marketing group, so there's a lot of situations where we just want to add in other JavaScript files without developer permission.